Hello horror lovers, welcome to the channel. Before the terror begins, I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel, as it will help me a lot. Also, leave a comment telling me which city you're watching from, I'd love to know. Click the like button, all of this because the morning air was crisp as I stepped out of my car, the scent of pine and damp earth filling my lungs. I'd been looking forward to this hike for weeks, a chance to clear my head and reconnect with nature. As I shouldered my backpack and locked the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "You're just being paranoid, Alex," I muttered to myself, adjusting the straps on my pack. "It's going to be a great day." The trailhead beckoned, a narrow path disappearing into the dense forest. I took a deep breath and started walking, the familiar crunch of gravel under my boots slowly giving way to the soft whisper of fallen leaves. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the canopy above grew thicker, dappling the forest floor with shifting patterns of light and shadow. Birds called to each other in the distance, their songs echoing through the trees. It should have been peaceful, but with each step, an uneasy feeling grew in the pit of my stomach. I paused, taking a swig from my water bottle and trying to shake off the sensation. "Get it together," I chided myself. "You've hiked this trail a dozen times." But something was different today. The forest seemed too quiet, the shadows too deep. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more frequently, half expecting to see someone, or something, watching me from behind the trees. As I rounded a bend in the trail, a flash of color caught my eye. Something pale and out of place among the rich browns and greens of the forest floor. Curiosity overrode my apprehension, and I stepped off the path to investigate. "What the hell?" I whispered, my heart beginning to race as I approached the disturbed area of earth. Leaves and branches had been hastily scattered over a patch of freshly turned soil. With trembling hands, I brushed away the meager covering, revealing a sight that would haunt me for years to come. A human hand, pale and lifeless, protruded from the shallow grave. I stumbled backward, my legs weak, and my mind reeling. "No, no, no," I gasped, unable to tear my eyes away from the horrific scene before me. The sound of a twig snapping nearby jolted me back to reality. I spun around, scanning the forest with wide, frightened eyes. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky and uncertain. "Is anyone there?" Silence was the only response, but I could feel it. A presence, watching, waiting. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I realized with sickening clarity that I was no longer alone in this once tranquil forest. "I need to get out of here," I whispered to myself, trying to control my panicked breathing. "I need to find help." As I turned to run back to the trail, movement caught my eye. A figure, partially obscured by a tree, stood watching me. Our eyes met for a brief, terrifying moment before I bolted. Branches whipped at my face as I ran, my heart pounding in my ears. I could hear heavy footsteps behind me, gaining ground with each passing second. "Help!" I screamed, knowing it was futile in the depths of the forest. "Somebody please help me!" The peaceful hike I had planned had turned into a nightmare, and as I ran for my life, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The forest, once a sanctuary, had become a labyrinth of terror, and somewhere behind me, a killer was giving chase. My legs felt like lead as I forced myself to keep running. The once peaceful forest had transformed into a green maze of terror, branches whipping my face as I tore through the underbrush. Every snapping twig sounded like a gunshot, my pursuer's footsteps echoing in my ears. "Keep going, Alex," I gasped to myself between ragged breaths. "Don't you dare stop." I risked a glance over my shoulder, catching a glimpse of a dark figure weaving through the trees behind me. The sight sent a fresh surge of adrenaline coursing through my veins, propelling me forward with renewed desperation. Suddenly, my foot caught on an exposed root, sending me sprawling face first onto the forest floor. I tasted dirt and blood as I scrambled to my feet, spitting out leaves in panic. "No, no, no," I muttered, my hands shaking as I tried to orient myself. Which way had I been running? A twig snapped nearby, followed by a low, menacing chuckle. "You can't run forever," a gravelly voice called out. far too close for comfort. Terror seized my heart as I picked a direction and sprinted. My lungs burned, each breath feeling like fire in my chest. I'd never been so acutely aware of my own mortality as I was in that moment, running for my life through a forest that now felt more like a tomb. As I ran, my mind raced with fragmented thoughts. Who was chasing me? Why? What would happen if they caught me? The image of the pale hand protruding from the shallow grave flashed before my eyes, spurring me to push harder. "Help!" I screamed between gasps. "Somebody, please!" My cries echoed through the trees, mocking me with their futility. I knew there was little chance of anyone hearing me this deep in the woods, but I couldn't stop myself from trying. The sound of rushing water reached my ears, growing louder with each step. Hope surged within me. Maybe I was nearing the river that cut through the forest. If I could reach it, I might be able to lose my pursuer. I burst through a line of trees, my heart soaring as I saw a clearing ahead. But as quickly as hope had risen, it plummeted. I skidded to a stop at the edge of a steep ravine, the river I'd heard churning far below. "No," I whispered, looking frantically left and right for any sign of a way down. "This can't be happening." "End of the line," the gravelly voice called out from the trees behind me. I spun around, my back to the ravine, as a figure emerged from the shadows. He was tall, dressed in dark clothing, with a face hidden beneath the brim of a worn baseball cap. In his hand glinted the unmistakable shape of a hunting knife. "Please," I begged, my voice cracking. "I won't tell anyone what I saw. Just let me go." The man chuckled, a sound devoid of any warmth or humanity. "I'm afraid I can't do that. You've seen too much." He took a step forward, and I instinctively moved back, feeling loose rocks shift under my feet at the edge of the ravine. "You don't have to do this," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the terror coursing through me. "Whatever's happened, we can fix it. Just put the knife down." "Fix it?" the man snarled. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into, boy. There's no fixing this." He lunged forward suddenly, the knife slashing through the air where I had been standing a moment before. I jerked backward on instinct, feeling the ground give way beneath my feet. Time seemed to slow as I teetered on the edge of the ravine, arms windmilling desperately. The last thing I saw was the look of surprise on my attacker's face before I plummeted backwards into the abyss, the roar of the river rising up to meet me. As I fell, a single thought flashed through my mind. This was far from over. The icy water of the river shocked me back to consciousness. I flailed wildly, gasping for air as the current swept me downstream. Somehow I managed to grab onto a protruding tree root, pulling myself towards the bank with trembling arms. Coughing and sputtering, I dragged myself onto the muddy shore. Every part of my body ached, but I was alive. The roar of the river masked any other sounds, and for a moment, I allowed myself to hope that I had lost my pursuer. "Get up," I wheezed to myself. "You can't stay here." On shaky legs, I stumbled into the cover of the trees. The fading light told me that evening was approaching, adding a new level of urgency to my situation. I needed to find help before nightfall, but I also couldn't risk running into my attacker again. I spotted a massive fallen tree a short distance away and made my way towards it. The hollowed-out trunk could provide some cover while I caught my breath and tried to formulate a plan. As I huddled in my makeshift shelter, I strained my ears for any sign of pursuit. The forest had grown unnaturally quiet, as if holding its breath. My own ragged breathing seemed thunderous in the silence. "Think, Alex," I muttered. "What's the best move here?" I knew I couldn't stay put for long. The killer would surely be searching for me, and I was leaving an obvious trail with my soaked clothes. But in which direction should I go? I had no idea where I was in relation to the trailhead or any roads. A twig snapped nearby, and I froze. Peering through a gap in the log, I saw a pair of muddy boots slowly walking past my hiding spot. My heart pounded so loudly I was certain it would give me away. Come out, wherever you are," the gravelly voice called, a sickening playfulness in his tone. "You're only making this harder on yourself." I held my breath as the footsteps paused right beside the log. A bead of water dripped from my hair, landing with what seemed like a deafening plop on a dry leaf. The boots turned towards my hiding place. "I know you're close," the man said, his voice low and menacing. "I can smell your fear." I closed my eyes, silently praying for a miracle. The seconds stretched into an eternity as I waited for the inevitable moment when he would discover me. Suddenly, a flock of birds burst from a nearby tree, startled by some unseen disturbance. The killer's head snapped towards the sound. "Clever boy," he muttered, "but not clever enough." The boots moved away, crunching through the underbrush in the direction of the bird's flight. I waited until I could no longer hear his footsteps before allowing myself to breathe again. "That was too close," I whispered, my whole body shaking. I knew I couldn't stay in the log any longer. It was only a matter of time before he circled back, and I needed to put as much distance between us as possible. Gathering what little courage I had left, I emerged from my hiding place. The forest was bathed in the golden light of sunset, long shadows stretching across the ground. I picked a direction opposite from where the killer had gone and started moving, every sense on high alert. As I walked, questions raced through my mind. Who was this man? Why had he killed those people? And why was he so determined to silence me? The snapping of a branch behind me sent a jolt of fear down my spine. I spun around, half expecting to see the killer lunging at me with his knife. Instead, I locked eyes with a startled deer. We stared at each other for a moment before it bounded away into the gathering darkness. I let out a shaky laugh, relief mixing with hysteria. "Get a grip, Alex," I told myself. "You're jumping at shadows now." But as night began to fall in earnest, I knew that the real nightmare was far from over. Somewhere in this darkening forest, a killer was hunting me, and I was running out of time to find help. With renewed determination, I pushed on through the twilight, praying that each step would lead me closer to safety and further from the grasp of the man who wanted me dead. The forest had become an impenetrable maze of shadows and whispers. Every muscle in my body ached as I forced myself to keep moving, knowing that stopping meant certain death. The adrenaline that had fueled my escape was waning, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm me. "Just a little further," I muttered to myself, though I had no idea where I was going. "You can do this, Alex." The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers trying to snag my clothes. Every shadow held the potential threat of my pursuer, and I found myself jumping at the slightest sound. As I pushed through a dense thicket, a sharp pain lanced through my arm. I bit back a cry, examining the long scratch left by a thorny branch. Blood welled up, a stark reminder of my vulnerability in this hostile environment. "Get it together," I hissed, tearing a strip from my shirt to bind the wound. "You can't afford to leave a trail." Just then, a twig snapped loudly behind me. I whirled around, heart pounding, only to see a rabbit darting away into the underbrush. The relief was short-lived as I realized how on edge I truly was. "Hello?" a voice called out, causing me to nearly jump out of my skin. "Is someone there?" I froze, unsure if this was a trap or a genuine offer of help. The voice sounded young, possibly female, but I couldn't be certain. "Please, if anyone's out there, I need help," the voice called again, closer this time. Against my better judgment, I decided to respond. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice hoarse from fear and exertion. A figure emerged from behind a large oak tree, a young woman probably in her early 20s, looking as frightened and disheveled as I felt. "Oh, thank God," she said, relief evident in her voice. "I thought I was going to die out here alone." I approached cautiously, still wary of a potential trap. "Who are you? What are you doing out here?" "I'm Emily," she replied, wringing her hands nervously. "I was hiking with my boyfriend, but we got separated hours ago. I've been wandering around lost ever since. Who are you?" "Alex," I said, still keeping my distance. "Listen, Emily, We need to get out of here. There's someone dangerous in these woods. Emily's eyes widened. What do you mean, dangerous? Before I could respond, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the forest, causing both of us to jump. Emily grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. What was that? She whispered, terror evident in her voice. I don't know, I replied, my mind racing. But we can't stay here. We need to move now. As we started to run, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about this encounter. How had Emily survived out here for hours without running into the killer? And why did she seem more scared by a distant scream than by my warning about a dangerous person in the woods? Night was falling rapidly now, the last vestiges of daylight fading away. The forest transformed into a labyrinth of menacing shadows, every tree and bush a potential hiding place for our pursuer. Alex, Emily panted as we ran. I think I recognize this area. There's an old ranger station not far from here. We might be able to find help there. I hesitated, torn between the need for shelter and my growing suspicion of this convenient savior. But as another scream pierced the night closer this time, I realized we were out of options. Lead the way, I said, hoping I wasn't making a fatal mistake. As we plunged deeper into the darkening forest, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Whether from the encroaching night, the unseen threat behind us, or the uncertain ally beside me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was running headlong into an even greater danger. The night closed in around us, and with it came a new level of terror I wasn't prepared to face, but I pushed on, knowing that to stop now would mean certain death. Whatever lay ahead, it had to be better than the nightmare at our heels. Darkness enveloped us as Emily and I stumbled through the forest, the trees morphing into a labyrinth of ominous silhouettes. Every shadow seemed to pulse with malevolent life, and the once familiar woods had become an alien landscape of terror. Are you sure you know where we're going? I whispered to Emily, my voice tight with fear and exhaustion. She nodded, her face barely visible in the gloom. I think so. The ranger station should be just ahead. I wanted to believe her, but doubt gnawed at me. Something about this situation felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. We pressed on, using the trees for guidance, our labored breathing the only sound breaking the eerie silence. Suddenly, a howl pierced the night, sending shivers down my spine. It sounded close, too close for comfort. What was that? Emily gasped, clutching my arm. Probably just a wolf, I replied, trying to sound calmer than I felt. Let's keep moving. As we pushed forward, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf had me spinning around, expecting to see our pursuer lunging from the shadows. Alex, Emily whispered urgently. I think I see a light ahead. Hope surged through me as I squinted into the darkness. There, barely visible through the trees, was a faint glow. The ranger station. It had to be. Come on, I said, grabbing Emily's hand. We're almost there. We quickened our pace, fueled by the promise of safety. But in our haste, I failed to notice the change in terrain. My foot caught on an exposed root, and suddenly I was falling, tumbling down a steep, unseen incline. Alex! Emily's scream faded as I rolled, branches and rocks battering my body. I came to a stop at the bottom of the ravine, dazed and battered. As I struggled to my feet, I realized with horror that I was alone. Emily? I called out, my voice echoing in the darkness. Emily? Where are you? No response came. I spun around, trying to get my bearings, when a beam of light cut through the darkness, momentarily blinding me. Well, a familiar gravelly voice chuckled. Looks like the chase is finally over. My blood ran cold as the killer stepped into view, flashlight in one hand, knife glinting in the other. And next to him, looking not at all distressed, stood Emily. You, I gasped, understanding dawning. You were working with him all along. Emily shrugged, a cold smile playing on her lips. Nothing personal, Alex. Just doing my job. Why? I asked, backing away slowly. Why are you doing this? The killer laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. You really have no idea what you've stumbled into, do you, boy? I frantically scanned my surroundings, looking for any means of escape. That's when I saw it, a break in the trees, revealing the faint outline of a road in the distance. You won't get away with this, I said, trying to keep them talking while I inched towards my only hope of salvation. Oh, but we already have, Emily replied. No one's going to miss another hiker who took a wrong turn in these woods. In that moment, I made my decision. With a burst of energy I didn't know I still possessed, I turned and sprinted towards the road, ignoring the shouts and pounding footsteps behind me. Branches whipped at my face as I ran, my lungs burning with each desperate breath. I could hear them gaining on me, but I didn't dare look back. The road grew closer with each step, a ribbon of asphalt promising safety if I could just reach it. As I burst out of the tree line, the beam of headlights suddenly illuminated the night. A car was approaching. This was my chance, my only chance. I lurched onto the road, waving my arms frantically, praying the driver would see me in time. The screech of brakes pierced the air as the car swerved, coming to a stop mere feet from where I stood. A concerned face peered out of the driver's window. "Hey, are you okay? What happened?" Words tumbled out of my mouth as I tried to explain, glancing fearfully back at the woods where my pursuers had melted away into the shadows. As the driver helped me into the car, promising to take me to safety, I realized that while I might have escaped for now, my nightmare was far from over. The truth behind the forest graves and the people hunting me was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. And somehow, I knew that this was only the beginning of a much larger, more terrifying story. The headlights of the car cut through the darkness, illuminating the road ahead as we sped away from the forest. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I huddled in the passenger seat, every shadow outside the window a potential threat. "You're safe now, son," the driver, an older man with kind eyes and a weathered face, reassured me. "Name's Frank. Want to tell me what happened back there?" I opened my mouth to speak, but where could I even begin? The words tumbled out in a frantic jumble. There was a grave, in the forest, and then someone was chasing me. They tried to kill me. There were 2 of them. They're still out there. Frank's brow furrowed as he glanced at me, concern etched on his face. All right. Take a deep breath. We're heading into town now. We'll get you to the police station, and you can tell them everything." As we approached the outskirts of the small town, relief washed over me. Streets, lamps, and house lights replaced the oppressive darkness of the forest. People, civilization, safety. But as we passed by a parked car, my blood ran cold. A familiar face peered out from behind the wheel. Emily. "Stop the car," I shouted, causing Frank to swerve slightly. "What? What's wrong?" he asked, alarmed. "That car we just passed, the woman inside, she's one of them. She's working with the killer." Frank's expression shifted from concern to skepticism. "Son, are you sure? Maybe you're just shaken up and—" "I'm not imagining things," I insisted, my voice rising with panic. "Please, we have to go back. We have to tell the police." Frank hesitated for a moment before nodding. "All right, the station's just up ahead. We'll let the professionals handle this." As we pulled into the police station parking lot, I felt a mix of relief and dread. Would they believe me? Or would they dismiss my story as the ravings of a traumatized hiker? The fluorescent lights inside the station were harsh after hours in the darkness. I squinted as a desk sergeant approached us. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he asked, eyeing my disheveled appearance with suspicion. Frank spoke up. "Found this young man on the road out by Willow Creek. Says he saw something in the forest. Thought you folks should hear about it." The next hour was a blur of questions, statements, and doubtful looks. I recounted my story multiple times, each telling making it sound more unbelievable to my own ears. "So let me get this straight," Detective Simmons, a stern-faced woman in her 40s, said. "You stumbled upon a shallow grave in the woods, were chased by a killer, met a woman who turned out to be working with said killer, and then managed to escape and flag down a passing car." Put like that, it sounded absurd, but I knew what I had seen. I know how it sounds, but I'm telling you the truth. There are bodies out there. People are in danger. Detective Simmons exchanged a look with her partner before turning back to me. We'll send a team out to investigate the area you described. In the meantime, I suggest you get some rest. You've been through quite an ordeal. As they led me to a small room with a cot, promising to keep me safe for the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The doubt in their eyes told me they didn't fully believe my story. Just as I was about to lay down, a commotion outside drew everyone's attention. My heart stopped as I imagined the killer had found me. "What's going on?" I asked the officer stationed outside my door. He peered down the hallway. "Looks like they're bringing in a drunk and disorderly. Nothing to worry about." Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. As I settled onto the cot, my mind raced with unanswered questions. Who were the killers? Why were they after me? And most importantly, how deep did this conspiracy go? As exhaustion finally overtook me, one thing was certain. My nightmare was far from over. It had only just begun. The first light of dawn was breaking as I led a team of officers back into the forest. My stomach churned with each step, the memories of my terrifying ordeal still fresh in my mind. Detective Simmons walked beside me, her face a mask of professional skepticism. "All right, Alex," she said, her voice cutting through the morning mist. "You said the grave was near a large oak tree with a distinctive split trunk. Does any of this look familiar?" I scanned the surroundings, fighting against the panic that threatened to overwhelm me. Everything looked different in the daylight, less menacing but no less confusing. I think it's this way," I stammered, pointing towards a dense thicket. As we pushed through the undergrowth, the whispers of the officers behind me grew more audible. "Wild goose chase," one muttered. "Kids probably making it all up," another replied. I clenched my fists, determined to prove them wrong. I knew what I had seen, what I had experienced. It couldn't all be in my head. Suddenly, a familiar landmark caught my eye. The split oak tree. "There!" I exclaimed, my heart racing. "It's just beyond that tree." Detective Simmons raised her hand, signaling the team to approach cautiously. As we neared the spot, I held my breath, praying that I hadn't imagined it all. The disturbed earth came into view, leaves and branches hastily scattered over the area. Relief flooded through me, quickly followed by a renewed sense of horror as the reality of what lay beneath sank in. "Oh my God," one of the younger officers gasped. He was telling the truth. Detective Simmons's demeanor changed instantly. She barked orders to secure the scene and call for forensics. As the team sprang into action, she turned to me, her eyes now filled with a mix of apology and grim determination. "Alex, I owe you an apology. We should have taken your story more seriously from the start." I nodded, unable to speak as I watched the officers carefully remove the cover from the shallow grave. The pale hand I had first discovered came into view, causing my stomach to lurch. I turned away, retching behind a nearby tree. As I wiped my mouth, trying to regain my composure, a shout from one of the officers caught everyone's attention. "Detective, we've found more disturbed areas. I think there might be multiple graves." The color drained from Detective Simmons's face. "My God," she whispered. "What have we stumbled into?" As the gravity of the situation sank in, I felt a strange mix of vindication and terror. They believed me now, but at what cost? How many lives had been lost in this forest? One of the officers approached, his face pale. "Ma'am, we've uncovered 3 more graves so far, and there are signs that they might not be the only ones." Detective Simmons turned to me, her expression grave. "Alex, I need you to tell me everything again. Every detail, no matter how small. Whoever did this is still out there, and we need to stop them before they kill again." As I began to recount my story once more, a twig snapped in the distance. Everyone froze, hands moving to holsters. The forest suddenly felt alive with unseen threats. "Probably just an animal," one of the officers said, but his voice lacked conviction. As we headed back to town, The weight of what we'd discovered hung heavy in the air. The peaceful forest had revealed its dark secret, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Detective Simmons placed a hand on my shoulder. "We'll get to the bottom of this, Alex. You're under police protection now. We won't let anything happen to you." But as we emerged from the tree line, I noticed an unfamiliar car parked across the street from my house. A chill ran down my spine as I realized this was far from over. The killer was still out there, and they knew who I was. The question now was, how far would they go to keep their secrets buried? Days blurred together in a haze of police interviews, sleepless nights, and paralyzing fear. I sat in the small conference room of the police station, my hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of coffee as Detective Simmons paced back and forth. "Alex, I need you to focus," she said, her voice tinged with frustration. "Can you remember anything else about the woman you met in the forest? Any distinguishing features?" I closed my eyes, trying to conjure up Emily's face. "I've told you everything I can remember. Brown hair, probably in her 20s, average height. She seemed so normal, so helpful at first." Detective Simmons sighed, rubbing her temples. "And you're certain she was working with the killer?" "Absolutely," I nodded emphatically. "She led me right to him. It was a trap." As we continued to go over the details for what felt like the 100th time, a commotion outside the room caught our attention. Detective Simmons excused herself to investigate. Left alone, I pulled out my phone, scrolling through news articles about the Forest Graves case. The story had exploded, dominating local headlines and even catching the attention of national media. "Alex Turner, the hiker who uncovered a killer's dumping ground, is working closely with local law enforcement," one article read. My stomach churned as I realized just how exposed I had become. Detective Simmons returned, her face grim. "Alex, we need to talk about your safety. The media frenzy is making it difficult to keep you under the radar." "What do you mean?" I asked, a fresh wave of fear washing over me. "We've had reports of suspicious individuals asking questions about you around town. We think it's time to move you to a safe house." As the reality of the situation sank in, a knock at the door interrupted us. Officer Jensen, a young cop I'd come to know over the past few days, poked his head in. "Detective, we've got a situation. Another body's been found." Detective Simmons cursed under her breath. "Where?" "By the old mill, just outside of town. It looks fresh." My blood ran cold. "They're still out there, aren't they? Still killing?" Detective Simmons nodded grimly. "I'm afraid so, Alex. And this is a message. They want us to know they're not done." As they discussed the new development, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I glanced out the window, my eyes scanning the busy street below. A man in a dark jacket caught my attention, his gaze fixed on the police station. "Detective," I interrupted, my voice shaking. "That man across the street, he's been there for hours." She moved to the window, her hand instinctively moving to her weapon. "Jensen, get a team down there now, discreetly." But as officers moved to apprehend the man, he melted into the crowd, disappearing from view. "Damn it," Detective Simmons muttered. "Alex, pack your things. We're moving you to the safe house tonight." As I gathered my meager belongings, my mind raced. How had my life changed so drastically in just a few days? I was now at the center of a murder investigation, a target for killers I couldn't identify. That night, as we drove to the undisclosed location of the safe house, I couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning of a much larger, more terrifying story. The forest had given up some of its secrets, but many more remained buried, waiting to be uncovered. And somewhere out there, the killers were watching, waiting for their chance to silence me permanently. As the lights of the town faded behind us, I realized that my normal life had disappeared with them. From now on, every shadow would hold a potential threat, every stranger a possible enemy. The hunt was on, and I was both the key witness and the prime target. The safe house was a nondescript suburban home, its normalcy a stark contrast to the turmoil of my life. I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by stacks of newspapers and printouts, my eyes burning from hours of research. Lily Carpenter, I mumbled, the name of the first identified victim echoing in my head. Her smiling face from an old missing persons report seemed to stare back at me, accusing. Detective Simmons entered the room, dark circles under her eyes betraying her exhaustion. Any progress, Alex? I nodded, pushing a pile of papers towards her. I think I've found something. Look at these missing persons reports from the last 5 years. There's a pattern. She leafed through the documents, her brow furrowing. They're all young women between 20 and 30. Most of them were last seen in or around forested areas. Exactly, I said, a grim excitement in my voice. And look at the dates. There's a cluster of disappearances every summer like clockwork. Detective Simmons' eyes widened as she saw the pattern emerge. My God, how did we miss this? This isn't just a killer, it's a serial killer, I finished. And they've been active for years. As we pored over the evidence, a sharp knock at the door made us both jump. Officer Jensen entered, his face pale. Detective, we've got a problem. There's been a break-in at the station. The evidence from the forest graves, it's gone. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Detective Simmons was the first to speak, her voice tight with anger. How is that possible? The security was compromised, Jensen interrupted. And that's not all. The digital files, the autopsy reports, they've been wiped. It's like the case never existed. My heart raced as I realized the gravity of the situation. They're erasing it all. They're trying to make it disappear. Detective Simmons turned to me, her expression grave. Alex, I think it's time we consider the possibility that this goes beyond just a serial killer. The level of coordination, the access they seem to have, we might be dealing with something much bigger. As if on cue, my phone buzzed with a news alert. I read it aloud, my voice shaking. Local police deny rumors of serial killer, claim forest graves were a hoax. What? Detective Simmons snatched the phone, her face contorting with disbelief as she read. This is impossible. We have witnesses, evidence. Had evidence, I corrected grimly. It's gone now, remember? A heavy silence fell over the room as we grappled with the implications. Whoever we were up against had the power to erase an entire investigation, to rewrite the truth. Suddenly a thought struck me. The articles I collected, the research we've done here, it might be the only evidence left. Detective Simmons nodded, her resolve hardening. We need to get this information out, make it public before they can suppress it. As we began to formulate a plan, a movement outside the window caught my eye. A car I didn't recognize was parked across the street, its occupant watching the house intently. Detective? I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I think we're being watched. She moved to the window, her hand instinctively reaching for her weapon. Jensen, call for backup. Quietly. As tension filled the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on the precipice of something much larger and more terrifying than we had initially imagined. The forest graves were just the tip of the iceberg, and we were about to plunge into depths from which we might never resurface. The watcher in the car made no move to leave, a silent reminder that in this deadly game of cat and mouse, we were very much the prey. And as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, I realized that our safe house might not be so safe after all. Heart pounding, I slipped out the back door of the safe house, Detective Simmons' words echoing in my ears. Get to the library, Alex. Upload everything we have. It's our only chance to get the truth out. The weight of the flash drive in my pocket felt like a ticking bomb as I made my way down the quiet suburban streets. Every car that passed made me flinch. Every shadow seemed to hold a potential threat. As I approached the town center, the streets grew busier. I ducked into a crowded store, hoping to lose anyone who might be following me in the sea of shoppers. Can I help you find anything? a cheerful sales assistant asked, making me jump. No, I'm just browsing, I stammered, trying to act normal as I scanned the faces around me for any sign of pursuit. As I weaved through the aisles, a familiar face caught my eye. My high school chemistry teacher, Mr. Dawson, was examining a display of kitchen gadgets. Alex? Alex Turner, is that you? He called out, a smile spreading across his face. I froze, torn between the urge to run and the need to maintain my cover. Mr. Dawson, hi, I managed, forcing a smile. He approached, oblivious to my discomfort. I've been seeing you all over the news lately. That business in the forest must have been quite an ordeal. Yeah, it was. Intense, I replied, my eyes darting around the store. Mr. Dawson's brow furrowed with concern. Are you all right, Alex? You seem on edge. Before I could respond, a hand grabbed my shoulder. I nearly collapsed with relief when I saw it was my mother, her face etched with worry. Alex, thank God I found you. I've been so worried, she said, pulling me into a tight embrace. As we left the store, my mother's grip on my arm was almost painful. What were you thinking leaving the safe house? Detective Simmons called me in a panic. Mom, I had to. I tried to explain as we hurried down the street. We have evidence that needs to get out before they can bury it all. She shook her head, her voice tight with fear. Alex, you don't understand how dangerous this is. These people, they're not just killers. They have power, influence. As we turned a corner, I noticed a strange car parked across the street. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I realized it was the same one I'd seen outside the safe house. Mom, I whispered urgently, we need to get off the street, now. We ducked into a narrow alley, our backs pressed against the cold brick wall. As we waited in tense silence, I could hear footsteps approaching. Alex, my mother whispered, her voice trembling. There's something I need to tell you, something about your father, and why he really left. I stared at her in confusion, but before she could continue, a shadow fell across the entrance to the alley. A figure stood there, backlit by the street lamps, impossible to identify. Well, well, a familiar voice called out, sending chills down my spine. Looks like our little game of cat and mouse is coming to an end. As the figure stepped into the alley, I felt my world tilt on its axis. It was a face I knew well, one I had trusted. In that moment, I realized that the conspiracy ran deeper than I could have ever imagined, and that no one, not even those closest to me, could be fully trusted. The flash drive in my pocket felt heavier than ever, the weight of the truth it contained suddenly seeming like an impossible burden. As the familiar face smiled coldly at us, I knew that the next few moments would determine not just my fate, but the fate of all those lost souls in the forest graves. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a small voice whispered that this was only the beginning of the revelations to come. Sarah's eyes fluttered open, the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room momentarily blinding her. As her vision adjusted, she became aware of a dull ache permeating her entire body. Confusion washed over her as she tried to piece together how she had ended up here. A gentle hand touched her arm, and she turned to see a nurse smiling down at her. Welcome back, Sarah. You've been through quite an ordeal. Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but her throat felt like sandpaper. The nurse quickly offered her a cup of water, holding it steady as Sarah took small sips. What happened? Sarah finally managed to croak out. The nurse's smile faltered slightly. You were in a car accident, dear. You've been in a coma for the past 2 weeks. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. 2 weeks? Her mind raced, trying to recall the last thing she remembered. Flashes of screeching tires and shattering glass flickered through her mind, but the details remained frustratingly out of reach. Your family has been here every day, the nurse continued, her voice soft and reassuring. They'll be so relieved to know you're awake. I'll go notify the doctor and give them a call. As the nurse left the room, Sarah struggled to process this new reality. She wiggled her toes and fingers, relieved to find that everything seemed to be working, albeit painfully. Her gaze drifted to the window where she could see the faint outline of trees swaying in the wind beyond the partially drawn curtains. The door opened again, and this time a tall man in a white coat entered, followed closely by the nurse. "Hello, Sarah, I'm Dr. Patel," he said, approaching her bedside. "I'm glad to see you're finally awake. How are you feeling?" Sarah considered the question for a moment. "Confused," she admitted, "and sore. Everything hurts." Dr. Patel nodded sympathetically. "That's to be expected. You sustained multiple injuries in the accident, including a severe concussion. We'll need to run some tests now that you're awake, but overall you've made remarkable progress." As the doctor began explaining her injuries and the recovery process ahead, Sarah found her mind wandering. There was something nagging at the edges of her memory, something important that she couldn't quite grasp. "Doctor," she interrupted suddenly, "was anyone else hurt in the accident?" A shadow passed over Dr. Patel's face, and he exchanged a quick glance with the nurse before answering. "I think it's best if we wait for your family to arrive before we discuss all the details of the accident. They should be here shortly." Sarah's heart began to race, setting off one of the monitors beside her bed. "Please," she pleaded. "I need to know. Was someone else in the car with me?" The doctor sighed, his expression grave. "Yes, Sarah. Your sister Emily was in the passenger seat." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as memories came flooding back. Emily's laugh as they sang along to the radio, the sudden glare of headlights coming around the bend, Sarah's desperate attempt to swerve out of the way. "Is she—" Sarah couldn't bring herself to finish the question. "She's alive," Dr. Patel assured her quickly. "But her injuries were more severe than yours. She's still in the ICU." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as guilt and fear threatened to overwhelm her. "This is all my fault," she whispered. The nurse stepped forward, placing a comforting hand on Sarah's shoulder. "It was an accident, dear. The other driver was intoxicated and crossed into your lane. You did everything you could." Sarah shook her head, unable to accept the absolution. "I was driving. I should have been able to avoid it somehow." "Sarah," Dr. Patel said firmly, "I need you to listen to me. You cannot blame yourself for this. The most important thing right now is to focus on your recovery and be there for your sister when she wakes up." A soft knock on the door interrupted them. Sarah's parents entered the room, their faces a mixture of joy and worry. "Oh, sweetheart," her mother cried, rushing to the bedside and carefully embracing her. "We've been so worried." Her father stood at the foot of the bed, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It's good to see you awake, kiddo." As her parents fussed over her, peppering her with questions and expressions of love, Sarah felt a strange sense of disconnection. Part of her longed to lose herself in their comfort, while another part felt she didn't deserve it. "Mom, Dad," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry about Emily. I never meant for any of this to happen." Her father's expression softened. "Sarah, listen to me. This was not your fault. We don't blame you, and neither does Emily." "How do you know?" Sarah asked, a hint of bitterness creeping into her voice. "She hasn't woken up yet." Her mother squeezed her hand. "Because we know our daughters. Emily loves you more than anything in this world. When she wakes up, she'll just be glad you're both alive." As her parents continued to offer words of comfort and reassurance, Sarah found herself torn between hope and despair. The road to recovery, both physical and emotional, would be long and difficult. But as she looked at the love and support surrounding her, she realized that she wouldn't have to travel it alone. With a deep breath, Sarah made a silent promise to herself and to Emily. She would get stronger, she would heal, and she would be there for her sister no matter what challenges lay ahead. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, and today, Sarah had taken hers. The steady beep of medical equipment filled the air as Sarah wheeled herself into Emily's hospital room. It had been 3 weeks since she'd awakened from her own coma, and while her body was healing, the weight of guilt still pressed heavily on her shoulders. Emily lay motionless on the bed, her pale face a stark contrast to the vibrant, laughing sister Sarah remembered. Tubes and wires snaked around her, each one a reminder of how precarious her condition remained. "Hey, Em," Sarah said softly, reaching out to take her sister's hand. "I'm here again. The doctors say you're getting stronger every day, but I really wish you'd wake up and tell me that yourself." She paused, fighting back tears. "I brought your favorite book. I thought maybe if I read to you it might help bring you back to us." Sarah opened the worn copy of Pride and Prejudice and began to read aloud, her voice trembling slightly at first but growing stronger as she lost herself in the familiar words. As she read, her mind drifted back to happier times. Late nights spent discussing literature, inside jokes about Mr. Darcy, dreams of visiting England together someday. A gentle knock on the door interrupted her reverie. She looked up to see Dr. Patel entering the room, a kind smile on his face. "How are we doing today, Sarah?" he asked, moving to check Emily's vitals. Sarah sighed, closing the book. "I'm okay, I guess. Any changes?" Dr. Patel shook his head. "Not yet, but her brain activity has been showing some promising patterns. Keep talking to her, reading to her. It really does help." As the doctor finished his examination, Sarah couldn't help but ask the question that had been plaguing her. "Dr. Patel, be honest with me. What are her chances of waking up?" The doctor's expression turned serious. "Sarah, in cases like this, it's impossible to give definitive answers. But Emily is young and was in excellent health before the accident. That works in her favor. We just need to be patient and keep hope alive." Sarah nodded, trying to draw strength from his words. As Dr. Patel left the room, she turned back to Emily, squeezing her hand gently. "You hear that, Em? You've got to keep fighting. There's so much we still need to do together." Just then, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Jake, her best friend since childhood. "Hey, how are you holding up? Want some company?" Sarah hesitated before replying. Since the accident, she'd been pushing away her friends, unable to face their concern and struggling to reconnect with her old life. But the loneliness was becoming unbearable. "Sure," she typed back. "I'm in Emily's room." 15 minutes later, Jake appeared in the doorway, a tentative smile on his face. "Hey, stranger," he said softly. Sarah managed a weak smile in return. "Hey yourself. Thanks for coming." Jake pulled up a chair next to Sarah's wheelchair. "Of course. I've been worried about you. We all have." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, both watching Emily's still form. Finally, Jake spoke again. "Remember that time in high school when Emily decided she was going to learn to skateboard?" Despite herself, Sarah felt a chuckle escape her lips. "Oh God, how could I forget? She was so determined even after she fell and sprained her wrist." Jake grinned. "That's Emily for you. Stubborn as hell when she sets her mind to something." As they continued to reminisce, sharing stories and memories, Sarah felt something inside her begin to shift. For the first time since the accident, she found herself laughing genuinely, the sound strange but welcome in the sterile hospital room. "I've missed this," she admitted quietly. "Missed you. All of you. I didn't know how to face everyone after what happened." Jake reached out, placing his hand over hers. "Sarah, you don't have to go through this alone. We're all here for you, and for Emily. Whatever you need, whenever you need it." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but this time, they weren't solely from grief or guilt. "Thank you," she whispered. As the afternoon wore on, more of their friends dropped by, each bringing a piece of the outside world with them. They shared updates on their lives, brought fresh flowers for the room, and surrounded Sarah with the warmth of friendship she'd been missing. By the time visiting hours were coming to an end, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope she hadn't experienced in weeks. She turned to Emily, squeezing her hand once more. "Did you hear all that, Em? Everyone's rooting for you. For us. So you better wake up soon because we've got a lot of catching up to do." As Sarah prepared to leave for the night, she cast one last look at her sister. For a moment, she could have sworn she saw Emily's finger twitch, but the movement was so slight she couldn't be sure. "Emily?" she called softly, heart racing. But there was no further response. Sarah took a deep breath, reminding herself of Dr. Patel's words about patience. Rome wasn't built in a day, and recovery wouldn't happen overnight. But for the first time since the accident, Sarah allowed herself to truly believe that better days were ahead. As she wheeled herself out of the room, Sarah made a silent vow. She would be there for Emily, every step of the way. And when, not if, but when, Emily opened her eyes, Sarah would be ready to help her sister rebuild their world, one day at a time. The early morning sun filtered through the hospital window, casting a warm glow across Emily's room. Sarah sat in her usual spot, her wheelchair positioned close to her sister's bedside. She'd arrived at dawn, unable to shake the feeling that something significant was about to happen. "Morning, Em," Sarah said softly, reaching out to smooth a stray strand of hair from her sister's forehead. "I had a dream about you last night. We were kids again, playing in that old treehouse Dad built for us. Remember how we used to pretend it was our secret castle?" Sarah paused, watching Emily's face for any sign of response. The doctors had been cautiously optimistic lately, noting increased brain activity, but Emily's eyes remained stubbornly closed. "I miss those days," Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I miss you. God, Em, I'd give anything to hear your voice again." As if on cue, Emily's fingers twitched slightly. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. "Emily," she called, squeezing her sister's hand. "Em, can you hear me?" For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, so faintly Sarah almost missed it, Emily's eyelids fluttered. "Oh my God," Sarah gasped. She frantically pressed the call button for the nurse, her eyes never leaving her sister's face. "Emily, if you can hear me, squeeze my hand." The pressure was weak, but unmistakable. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she watched her sister struggle to open her eyes. The room suddenly burst into activity as nurses and Dr. Patel rushed in, alerted by the change in Emily's vital signs. "She's waking up," Sarah explained breathlessly. "She squeezed my hand." Dr. Patel moved to Emily's side, checking her pupils and vital signs. "Emily," he called firmly. "Emily, can you open your eyes for me?" Slowly, painfully, Emily's eyes opened. They were unfocused at first, blinking against the light, but gradually settled on Sarah's face. "Sar." Emily's voice was hoarse from disuse, barely audible, but to Sarah, it was the most beautiful sound in the world. "I'm here, Em," Sarah choked out, tears flowing freely now. "I'm right here. You're okay." Dr. Patel continued his examination, asking Emily simple questions and checking her responses. Sarah watched anxiously, hardly daring to breathe. Finally, Dr. Patel turned to Sarah with a smile. "She's responsive and aware of her surroundings. This is a very positive sign, Sarah. We'll need to run some tests, but I'm optimistic about her recovery." As the medical team bustled around them, Sarah kept her eyes locked on Emily's. "You came back to me," she whispered. Emily's lips curved into a weak smile. "Always," she managed to rasp out. The next few hours passed in a blur. Their parents arrived, overjoyed and emotional at Emily's awakening. More tests were run, specialists consulted. Through it all, Sarah refused to leave her sister's side. As evening fell and things finally quieted down, Sarah found herself alone with Emily once more. Emily was more alert now, though still weak and tired easily. "Sarah," Emily said softly, her voice a little stronger after sips of water. What happened?" Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself. "We were in a car accident, Em. A drunk driver hit us. You've been in a coma for almost 2 months." Emily's eyes widened slightly. 2 months?" she repeated, struggling to process the information. Sarah nodded, fighting back fresh tears. "I'm so sorry, Emily. I should have been more careful. I should have—" "Stop," Emily interrupted. her hand tightening around Sarah's. Not your fault. But, no buts, Emily insisted, her familiar stubbornness shining through despite her weakened state. We're both here. That's what matters. Sarah let out a shaky breath, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. I was so scared I'd lost you, she admitted. Emily managed a small smile. Takes more than that to get rid of me. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both processing the enormity of the moment. Eventually, Emily spoke again. Sarah? She asked hesitantly. How bad is it? My injuries? Sarah squeezed her hand reassuringly. You've got a long recovery ahead, Em. But the doctors are optimistic. You'll need physical therapy, and it might take some time to regain your full strength. But you're alive, and you're awake. That's the most important thing. Emily nodded slowly, determination settling over her features. We'll face it, together. Always, Sarah promised, echoing Emily's earlier word. I'm not going anywhere. As the sun set outside the window, painting the room in soft hues of orange and pink, Sarah felt a sense of peace wash over her. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with ups and downs, triumphs and setbacks. But for the first time since the accident, she felt truly hopeful. Emily's eyes were growing heavy, the day's events catching up with her. Stay, she murmured, fighting to keep her eyes open. Of course, Sarah replied, settling more comfortably in her chair. I'll be right here when you wake up. As Emily drifted off to sleep, Sarah watched over her, grateful for this second chance. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them. The rhythmic tapping of crutches echoed through the hospital corridor as Emily made her way slowly towards the physical therapy room. Sarah walked beside her, ready to offer support if needed, but careful not to hover too closely. It had been 3 weeks since Emily had awakened from her coma, and each day brought new challenges and small victories. You're getting faster with those, Sarah observed, nodding towards the crutches. Emily managed a wry smile. Still feels like I'm moving through molasses. She paused to catch her breath, leaning against the wall. I used to run 5 miles before breakfast, and now I'm winded after 50 feet. Sarah placed a comforting hand on her sister's shoulder. Hey, remember what Dr. Patel said. It's a marathon, not a sprint. I know, Emily sighed. It's just frustrating sometimes. As they approached the physical therapy room, they could hear the sounds of equipment and muffled conversations. Emily straightened up, a look of determination settling over her features. Ready to kick some PT butt? Sarah asked with a grin. Emily nodded. Let's do this. They entered the room to find Mia, Emily's physical therapist, setting up some equipment. She greeted them with a warm smile. Good morning, ladies. Emily, how are you feeling today? Ready to work, Emily replied, her jaw set in concentration. Mia nodded approvingly. That's what I like to hear. We're going to try something new today. How do you feel about taking a few steps without the crutches? Emily's eyes widened slightly, a mix of excitement and apprehension crossing her face. Really? You think I'm ready? I do, Mia confirmed. We'll use the parallel bars for support, and Sarah and I will be right here with you. But I think it's time to see what those legs can do. As Mia helped Emily position herself at the start of the parallel bars, Sarah felt a knot of anxiety form in her stomach. She knew how important this moment was for her sister, and how devastating a setback could be. Emily gripped the bars tightly, her knuckles white with the effort. Slowly, she lifted her right foot and moved it forward a few inches. Then the left. Her arms shook with the strain of supporting her body weight. That's it, Emily, Mia encouraged. Nice and slow. Focus on each movement. Sarah watched, hardly daring to breathe, as Emily took another step. And another. Sweat beaded on her sister's forehead, and Sarah could see the tremendous effort each movement required. Halfway down the bars, Emily faltered. Her knee buckled slightly, and for a heart-stopping moment Sarah thought she might fall. But Emily gritted her teeth and held on, steadying herself. "You've got this, Em," Sarah called out softly. "You're doing amazing." Emily turned her head slightly, meeting Sarah's gaze. In that moment, Sarah saw a flicker of the old Emily, determined, unstoppable, brave. With renewed energy, Emily pressed on. As she neared the end of the bars, tears began to stream down Emily's face. But they weren't tears of pain or frustration. They were tears of triumph. With one final, shaky step, Emily reached the end. Mia quickly moved to support her as Emily's legs finally gave out, helping her into a waiting wheelchair. "You did it!" Mia exclaimed, her face beaming with pride. "Emily, that was incredible progress." Sarah rushed to her sister's side, enveloping her in a gentle hug. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. Emily leaned into the embrace, her body trembling from exertion and emotion. "I did it," she breathed. "I really did it." As Mia went to fetch some water, the sisters remained locked in their embrace. Finally, Emily pulled back slightly, wiping her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly, "for being here, for not giving up on me." Sarah felt her own eyes welling up. "Never. We're in this together, remember?" Emily nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. Together. The rest of the session passed in a blur of exercises and stretches. By the end, Emily was exhausted but exhilarated. As they prepared to leave, Mia pulled Sarah aside. "She's making remarkable progress," the therapist said quietly. "But there will still be tough days ahead. Just keep doing what you're doing. Your support means more than you know." Sarah nodded, watching as Emily chatted with another patient across the room. "She's the strongest person I know," she replied. "I'm just trying to be worthy of that strength." As they made their way back to Emily's room, the sisters fell into a comfortable silence. The hospital bustled around them, but in that moment, it felt like they were in their own little world. "Hey, Sarah," Emily said as they neared her room. Do you think we could go outside tomorrow? Just for a little while? I miss feeling the sun on my face." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. It was such a simple request, but it represented so much. Hope, progress, a step towards normalcy. "Of course," she managed. "We'll talk to Dr. Patel, but I'm sure we can make it happen." As they entered the room, Sarah helped Emily back into bed. The exertion of the day was catching up, and Emily's eyelids were growing heavy. "Rest now," Sarah said softly, adjusting the blankets. "Tomorrow, we'll chase the sun." As Emily drifted off to sleep, Sarah settled into her usual chair by the bedside. She pulled out a book, but her mind wandered to the future. There would be more challenges ahead, more obstacles to overcome. But for the first time in months, the path forward seemed clear and bright, illuminated by the unwavering bond between two sisters determined to face whatever came their way. Together. The gentle warmth of the morning sun caressed Emily's face as Sarah carefully maneuvered her wheelchair through the hospital's garden. It was a small, well-maintained space with winding paths, colorful flower beds, and a central fountain that provided a soothing background melody. "Oh, Sarah," Emily breathed, tilting her face upward. "This is wonderful." Sarah smiled, parking the wheelchair near a bench and sitting down beside her sister. "I told you we'd chase the sun, didn't I?" For a few moments they sat in companionable silence, drinking in the sights and sounds of the outdoors. It had been nearly 3 months since the accident, and this was Emily's first time outside since then. "I'd almost forgotten what it felt like," Emily murmured, her eyes closed as she basked in the sunlight. The breeze, the smell of flowers, the sound of birds. It's like experiencing everything for the first time again. Sarah reached out and squeezed her sister's hand. "I'm so glad we could do this. Dr. Patel thinks it'll be good for your recovery, both physically and mentally." Emily nodded, opening her eyes to look at Sarah. "He's right. I already feel more like myself than I have in weeks." As they sat together, a butterfly fluttered past, landing briefly on a nearby rosebush. Emily watched it with wonder, a childlike joy spreading across her features. "Remember when we used to catch butterflies in Mom's garden?" she asked, a hint of nostalgia in her voice. Sarah chuckled. "How could I forget? You were always so determined to name each one we caught." "Hey, Butterfly Bill and Madam Monarch were excellent names," Emily protested with a laugh. Their shared laughter filled the air, a sound that had once been so common between them, but had become rare in recent months. It felt like a return to normalcy, however brief. As their mirth subsided, Emily's expression grew more serious. "Sarah," she began hesitantly, "I've been thinking a lot about the future lately." Sarah tensed slightly, unsure of where this conversation was heading. "Oh? What about it?" Emily took a deep breath. "I know my recovery is going to be a long process, but I don't want it to put your life on hold. You've already sacrificed so much for me." You know I don't see it that way," Sarah interjected, but Emily held up a hand to stop her. "Please let me finish. I'm so grateful for everything you've done, for being here every step of the way. But I worry about you too. Your job, your friends, your life. I don't want you to lose yourself in taking care of me." Sarah felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. "Emily, you're my sister. There's nowhere else I'd rather be." "I know," Emily said softly, "and I love you for that. But I think it might be time for both of us to start looking forward, to think about what comes after the hospital, after the rehab." Sarah nodded slowly, understanding dawning. "You're right. I guess I've been so focused on the day-to-day that I haven't really thought much beyond that." Emily smiled, reaching out to take Sarah's hand. "Well, I have a proposition for you. When I'm released from the hospital, why don't we take that trip we've always talked about?" Sarah's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "The one to England? Are you sure? That's a big trip, and with your recovery." "I know it won't be easy," Emily admitted. "But think about it. We could rent a cozy cottage in the countryside, take things at our own pace. We could visit all those places we've read about in our favorite books. It could be a fresh start for both of us." As Emily spoke, Sarah felt a spark of excitement ignite within her. The idea was crazy, impractical even, but something about it felt right. "We'd have to talk to your doctors," Sarah said slowly. "Make sure you're cleared for travel, and we'd need to plan everything carefully, make sure we have all the necessary medical support." Emily's face lit up. "So you'll consider it?" Sarah couldn't help but smile at her sister's enthusiasm. "Yeah, I'll consider it." They spent the next hour in the garden, discussing potential plans and dreaming of future adventures. As they talked, Sarah noticed a change in Emily. There was a new light in her eyes, a sense of purpose that had been missing since the accident. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, signaling that it was time to return to Emily's room, Sarah felt a renewed sense of hope. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but for the first time in months, it felt like they were moving forward together, rather than just treading water. "Ready to head back?" Sarah asked, standing up to take the handles of Emily's wheelchair. Emily nodded, but then paused. "Sarah, thank you for everything. I know I don't say it enough, but I couldn't do this without you." Sarah leaned down and wrapped her arms around her sister in a gentle hug. "You don't have to thank me, Em. We're sisters. We're in this together, remember?" As they made their way back into the hospital, both sisters felt a shift in the air around them. The future, which had seemed so bleak and uncertain for so long, now held the promise of new beginnings. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them side by side, their bond stronger than ever. The journey of healing was far from over, but with each passing day, with each small victory and shared dream, Emily and Sarah were writing a new chapter in their story, one of resilience, hope, and the unbreakable love between sisters. The soft hum of the airplane's engines filled the cabin as Sarah glanced over at Emily, who was gazing out the window with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. It had been 6 months since that day in the hospital garden when they first discussed this trip, and now here they were, 30,000 feet above the Atlantic, bound for London. "How are you feeling?" Sarah asked, gently squeezing her sister's hand. Emily turned to her with a small smile. Nervous, excited, a little overwhelmed, but mostly grateful. The journey to this moment had been arduous. Months of intense physical therapy, countless doctor's appointments, and more than a few setbacks had tested their resolve. But Emily's determination, coupled with Sarah's unwavering support, had brought them here. "I still can't believe we're actually doing this," Sarah mused, shaking her head in wonder. Emily chuckled. "Well, believe it, sis. In a few hours, we'll be in Jane Austen country." As if on cue, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their descent into Heathrow Airport. The sisters exchanged a look of anticipation as they began to prepare for landing. Once they'd made it through customs and collected their luggage, they found themselves in the bustling arrivals hall. Sarah maneuvered Emily's wheelchair with practiced ease as they made their way towards the exit. "Okay, so according to the itinerary, we should have a driver waiting to take us to the cottage," Sarah said, consulting her phone. Emily nodded, her eyes darting around, taking in every detail of their new surroundings. "I can't believe how many people there are," she murmured. "It's a bit overwhelming after so much time in the hospital." Sarah placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We can take it slow, Em. Remember, this trip is all about healing and new experiences. No pressure." They soon found their driver, a cheerful middle-aged man named George, who helped them load their luggage into a spacious van equipped for Emily's needs. As they drove through the English countryside, the urban sprawl of London gave way to rolling hills and quaint villages. Emily pressed her face against the window, drinking in the scenery. "It's even more beautiful than I imagined," she breathed. Sarah smiled, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. The past year had been so focused on recovery and rehabilitation that moments of pure joy had been rare. Seeing the wonder on Emily's face made all the planning and worry worth it. After about an hour's drive, they pulled up to a charming stone cottage nestled among verdant fields. A wooden ramp had been installed at the entrance, a detail Sarah had insisted upon when booking their accommodations. George helped them unload their luggage and ensured they were settled before bidding them farewell. As the van pulled away, the sisters found themselves alone in their home for the next month. "Well," Sarah said, clapping her hands together, "shall we explore our new digs?" Emily nodded enthusiastically, and they began to move through the cottage. The interior was cozy and welcoming, with wide doorways to accommodate Emily's wheelchair and grab bars discreetly installed in key areas. As they reached the back of the cottage, they discovered a sunroom overlooking a beautiful garden. Emily's eyes lit up at the sight. "Oh, Sarah," she gasped, "this is perfect. Can you imagine having our morning tea out here?" Sarah grinned. "Already thinking about tea? We've barely been in the country an hour." They both laughed, the sound echoing through the empty cottage and filling it with warmth. As evening approached, Sarah busied herself unpacking while Emily rested in the sunroom, a book open on her lap but her gaze fixed on the garden outside. "Hey, Em," Sarah called from the kitchen. "What do you say we venture into the village for dinner? There's supposed to be a nice pub just down the road." Emily hesitated for a moment. "I don't know, Sarah. I'm pretty tired from the trip, and we haven't really tested out the terrain yet." Sarah came to join her sister, kneeling beside her wheelchair. "I know it's scary," she said softly. "But remember what Dr. Patel said. This trip is about pushing your boundaries, little by little. We don't have to stay long if you're uncomfortable." Emily took a deep breath, then nodded. "You're right. Let's do it." The walk to the village was slow but steady. Emily insisted on using her crutches rather than the wheelchair, determined to build her strength. Sarah walked beside her, ready to offer support but allowing her sister the independence she craved. As they entered the pub, the warm atmosphere and friendly faces immediately put them at ease. They found a table near the fireplace, and soon were engrossed in conversation with the locals, sharing their story and learning about the area. To new adventures, Emily said later that evening, raising her glass of cider and a toast. Sarah clinked her glass against her sister's. And to unbreakable bonds, she added. As they made their way back to the cottage under a canopy of stars, both sisters felt a sense of peace settle over them. The road to recovery was far from over, but this new chapter was off to a promising start. "Thank you for making this happen," Emily said softly as they reached the cottage door. Sarah wrapped an arm around her sister's shoulders. "We made it happen together, Em, and this is just the beginning." As they settled in for the night, the sisters felt a renewed sense of hope and possibility. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as they always had, side by side, two sisters against the world, ready to write the next chapter of their story in this new and beautiful setting. The morning sun filtered through the curtains of the cozy cottage bedroom, gently rousing Sarah from her slumber. She stretched, savoring the unfamiliar yet comforting sensation of waking up in a new place. As she padded quietly to the kitchen to start the kettle for tea, she heard soft murmurs coming from Emily's room. Concerned, Sarah approached her sister's door and knocked gently. "Em, you okay in there?" There was a pause before Emily's voice, thick with sleep and something else Sarah couldn't quite place, called out, "Yeah, come in." Sarah entered to find Emily sitting up in bed, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed. Immediately, Sarah was at her side. "What's wrong? Are you in pain?" she asked, her hand instinctively reaching for Emily's forehead to check for fever. Emily shook her head, a wry smile touching her lips. No pain. Just memories." Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, her brow furrowed with concern. "What kind of memories?" Emily took a deep breath. "I had a dream about the accident. It was so vivid, Sarah. I could hear the screeching tires, feel the impact." She trailed off, her hands trembling slightly. Sarah wrapped an arm around her sister's shoulders, pulling her close. "Oh, Em, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize you were still having nightmares." "They're not as frequent as they used to be," Emily admitted. "But being here, away from the familiar, I think it stirred things up." They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the distant chirping of birds outside the window. Finally, Sarah spoke. "You know, maybe this is a good thing," she said softly. Emily looked at her, confusion evident in her eyes. How could reliving that nightmare be good? Sarah chose her words carefully. "We've been so focused on your physical recovery, Em, but maybe it's time we address the emotional side of things too. This trip, it's not just about seeing new places. It's about healing in every sense of the word." Emily nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. "You're right. I've been pushing those feelings aside, trying to be strong. But they're still there, just below the surface." "What do you say we take a walk after breakfast?" Sarah suggested. "There's a lovely path through the woods nearby. We could talk or not talk, whatever you need." Emily managed a small smile. "That sounds perfect." An hour later, the sisters found themselves strolling along a sunlight-dappled path. Emily was using her crutches, moving slowly but steadily. The fresh air and gentle exercise seemed to lift her spirits. "You know," Emily said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I've been thinking a lot about that night, about how different things could have been." Sarah felt a familiar pang of guilt. No, let me finish," Emily interrupted gently. "I know you still blame yourself, Sarah, but I need you to hear this. What happened that night, it wasn't your fault. It wasn't anyone's fault except the drunk driver who hit us." Sarah felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. "But if I had been more careful, if I had seen him coming—" "Stop," Emily said firmly, coming to a halt and turning to face her sister. "You can't keep torturing yourself with what-ifs. The fact is, we're both here. We're both alive. And yes, our lives have changed, but we're facing those changes together." Sarah wiped at her eyes, a mix of emotions swirling within her. "When did you get so wise?" she asked with a watery chuckle. Emily grinned. "Must be all those Jane Austen novels. They're rubbing off on me." They continued their walk, the conversation flowing more freely now. They talked about the accident, about their fears and hopes for the future, about the challenges they'd faced and the ones still to come. As they neared a small clearing, Emily spotted a fallen log and suggested they take a break. Sitting side by side, they looked out over the verdant English countryside. "You know," Emily said thoughtfully, "I think this trip was exactly what we needed. Not just for my physical recovery, but for both of us to heal emotionally too." Sarah nodded in agreement. "It's like we needed to step away from our normal lives to really process everything that's happened." Emily leaned her head on Sarah's shoulder. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, you know. You've been my rock through all of this." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. "And you've been mine, Em. Your strength, your determination, it's been inspiring." As they sat there, surrounded by the beauty of nature and the comfort of each other's presence, both sisters felt a shift. The weight of the past, which had been hanging over them for so long, seemed to lift slightly. "So," Emily said, a mischievous glint in her eye, "what's next on our grand English adventure?" Sarah laughed, pulling out the guidebook they'd been using to plan their trip. "Well, there's a quaint little village not far from here that's supposedly Jane Austen's inspiration for Meryton in Pride and Prejudice. Fancy a visit?" Emily's face lit up with excitement. "Lead the way, dear sister. I have a feeling Mr. Darcy might be waiting for us." As they made their way back to the cottage, planning their next excursion, both Sarah and Emily felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road to recovery, both physical and emotional, was still long, but they were facing it together, stronger than ever. The English countryside had worked its magic, providing not just a change of scenery, but a chance for healing, understanding, and new beginnings. As they stepped back into their temporary home, Sarah and Emily knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as they always had. Side by side, two sisters against the world. The quaint village of Steventon bustled with activity as Sarah and Emily made their way down the cobblestone street. Colorful storefronts lined the road, and the air was filled with the chatter of locals and tourists alike. Emily, now more comfortable with her crutches, moved at a steady pace, her eyes wide with wonder. "I can't believe we're actually here," Emily breathed, taking in the sights. "It's like stepping into one of Austen's novels." Sarah grinned, equally enchanted by their surroundings. "I know. Half expect to see Mr. Darcy strutting down the street any minute now." As they approached a small bookshop, its windows filled with leather-bound classics and Jane Austen memorabilia, Emily suddenly lost her balance. She stumbled, her crutches clattering to the ground. "Em!" Sarah cried, reaching out to steady her sister. But before she could react, a tall, dark-haired man seemingly appeared out of nowhere, catching Emily before she fell. "Steady on there," he said, his voice tinged with a crisp British accent. "Are you all right, miss?" Emily, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment, nodded. "Yes, thank you. I'm still getting used to these." She gestured to her crutches, which Sarah was now retrieving from the ground. The man smiled warmly, making sure Emily was stable before releasing her. "No need to apologize, I'm just glad I was here to help." He extended his hand. "I'm James, by the way. James Fairfax." "Emily," she replied, shaking his hand. "And this is my sister, Sarah." Sarah, who had been watching the exchange with a mixture of concern and amusement, stepped forward to shake James's hand as well. "Thank you for your quick reflexes," Sarah said. "We're still adjusting to navigating these old streets." James's eyes lit up with interest. "Ah, you're not from around here then? Visiting?" Emily nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, we're from the States. We're on a bit of a Jane Austen pilgrimage." "Well, you've certainly come to the right place," James chuckled. "I actually work as a tour guide at Jane Austen's House Museum. If you're interested, I'd be happy to show you around." The sisters exchanged a look of excitement. "We'd love that," Sarah exclaimed. "We were planning to visit the museum tomorrow, actually." "Excellent," James said, his smile widening. "How about we meet here tomorrow morning, say around 10? I can give you a personalized tour." They agreed, and after exchanging contact information, bid James farewell. As they watched him walk away, Emily turned to Sarah with a mischievous grin. "Well, well," she teased. "Looks like we found our Mr. Darcy after all." Sarah rolled her eyes, but couldn't hide her smile. "Oh, hush. He was just being nice." The rest of the day passed in a blur of quaint shops and cozy tea rooms. By the time they returned to their cottage, both sisters were exhausted, but exhilarated. As they settled in for the night, Emily couldn't stop talking about their encounter with James and the upcoming tour. "It's funny," she mused, as Sarah helped her into bed. "A few months ago, I never would have imagined I'd be here doing this. I was so focused on what I couldn't do anymore." Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, her expression softening. "And now?" Emily smiled, a determined glint in her eye. "Now I'm realizing there's still so much I can do. Different maybe, but not less." Sarah felt a surge of pride for her sister. "You've come so far, Em. I hope you know how incredible you are." The next morning, they met James as planned. True to his word, he gave them a fascinating and detailed tour of Jane Austen's house museum. His knowledge was impressive, and his passion for the subject was infectious. As they walked through the gardens where Austen herself once strolled, James turned to Emily. "You know, I couldn't help but notice your determination yesterday. May I ask what happened?" Emily hesitated for a moment, then decided to share their story. She told James about the accident, the long months of recovery, and their decision to take this trip as part of her healing process. James listened intently, his expression a mix of admiration and empathy. When Emily finished, he said softly, "You remind me of someone." "Oh?" Emily raised an eyebrow, curious. James nodded. "My sister. She has cerebral palsy. Growing up, I watched her face every challenge with the same determination I see in you. It's inspiring." The conversation flowed easily after that. As they continued the tour, James shared more about his life, his work, and his love for literature. By the end of the day, it felt as if they'd known him for years rather than hours. As they were saying their goodbyes, James hesitated, then said, "Listen, I hope this isn't too forward, but there's a local literature festival happening this weekend. Would you both like to join me? I could show you some of my favorite spots in the area." Sarah and Emily exchanged a look, a silent conversation passing between them. Then, with a smile, Sarah turned to James. "We'd love to." As they walked back to their cottage that evening, both sisters felt a sense of excitement and possibility they hadn't experienced in a long time. "You know," Emily said thoughtfully, "I think this trip is turning out to be even more of an adventure than we expected." Sarah laughed, linking her arm through her sister's. "I think you're right, Em, and I can't wait to see what happens next." As the sun set over the English countryside, casting a golden glow over the rolling hills, Sarah and Emily felt a renewed sense of hope. Their journey of healing was taking unexpected turns, opening up new possibilities and connections they never could have anticipated. Whatever lay ahead, they were ready to face it together with open hearts and minds, eager for the next chapter in their ongoing adventure. The morning of the literature festival dawned bright and clear. Sarah helped Emily get ready, both sisters buzzing with excitement about the day ahead. "You seem extra chipper this morning," Sarah teased as she braided Emily's hair. Emily's cheeks flushed slightly. "I'm just excited about the festival. It's not every day we get to immerse ourselves in literary history like this." Sarah raised an eyebrow, a knowing smile playing on her lips. "Mm-hmm. And I'm sure it has nothing to do with a certain charming tour guide?" "Sarah," Emily exclaimed, her blush deepening. "James is just being kind. Besides, we're leaving in a couple of weeks. There's no point in, well, you know." Sarah's expression softened as she finished the braid. "Em, don't sell yourself short. This trip is about new experiences, remember? Who knows what might happen? Before Emily could respond, there was a knock at the cottage door. Sarah went to answer it, finding James on the other side, looking dapper in a tweed jacket. "Good morning, ladies," he greeted them cheerfully. "Ready for a day of literary adventure?" The festival was held in a sprawling park on the outskirts of town. Tents and booths were set up everywhere, filled with books, author talks, and interactive exhibits. James proved to be an excellent guide, steering them towards the most interesting events and introducing them to local authors and literary enthusiasts. As they approached a tent dedicated to Jane Austen, Emily's crutches slipped on a patch of wet grass. James was quick to steady her, his hand lingering on her arm a moment longer than necessary. "Careful there," he said softly. "We wouldn't want you to miss out on meeting our dear Jane, would we?" Emily laughed, ignoring the flutter in her stomach. "My hero," she joked. "What would I do without you to catch me?" As they entered the tent, Sarah noticed the way James's eyes lingered on Emily, a mix of admiration and something deeper in his gaze. She smiled to herself, happy to see her sister glowing with confidence and joy. The day flew by in a whirlwind of poetry readings, book signings, and animated discussions about literature. As the sun began to set, James suggested they end the day with a visit to his favorite spot, a hilltop overlooking the village. "It's a bit of a climb," he warned, looking at Emily with concern, "but the view is worth it, I promise." Emily set her jaw determinedly. "I'm up for it if you are." The climb was indeed challenging, but Emily persevered, with Sarah and James offering support when needed. When they finally reached the top, all three were breathless, but the view that greeted them was spectacular. The village lay spread out before them, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. Rolling hills stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with ancient trees and crisscrossed by winding streams. "Oh, James," Emily breathed, leaning on her crutches. "It's beautiful." James smiled, his eyes on Emily rather than the view. "Yes, it is." Sarah, sensing the moment between them, discreetly stepped away to take some photos, giving them a moment of privacy. "Emily," James said softly, turning to face her. "I know you're only here for a short time, but I feel like I've known you forever. Would it be all right if I wrote to you after you go back home?" Emily's heart raced. "I'd like that very much," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape, Emily felt a surge of emotion. This trip, which had started as a journey of physical healing, had become so much more. She was rediscovering parts of herself she thought she'd lost in the accident. Her sense of adventure, her capacity for joy, and even the flutter of romantic possibility. On the way back to the cottage, Emily was quieter than usual, lost in thought. Sarah nudged her gently. "Penny for your thoughts, sis." Emily smiled, a mix of happiness and melancholy in her eyes. "I was just thinking about how much has changed. A few months ago, I couldn't imagine feeling this alive again. But now..." Sarah wrapped an arm around her sister's shoulders. "Now you're conquering hills, falling in love with literature all over again. And maybe..." She waggled her eyebrows suggestively. "Falling for a dashing British tour guide?" Emily laughed, shoving her sister playfully. "Oh, stop it, but maybe. Is that crazy we're leaving so soon?" "It's not crazy at all," Sarah assured her. "It's beautiful. You're opening your heart to possibilities again, Em. That's what this trip was all about." As they reached the cottage, Emily paused at the door, looking back at the village bathed in twilight. "You know, when we first planned this trip, I thought it was about escaping our reality. But now I realize it's about embracing a new one." Sarah squeezed her sister's hand. "And whatever that new reality looks like, we'll face it together. Always." That night, as Emily lay in bed, her mind replayed the events of the day. The laughter, the literary discussions, the way James looked at her on that hilltop. For the first time in months, She fell asleep with a smile on her face, her dreams filled not with the echoes of screeching tires, but with the gentle lilt of James's voice reading Austen under an English sky. The sisters' journey was far from over, but as this chapter of their adventure came to a close, both felt a sense of renewal and hope. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them with the strength they'd rediscovered in each other and in themselves, among the rolling hills and timeless words of their literary pilgrimage. The gentle patter of rain against the cottage window roused Emily from her slumber. She blinked slowly, orienting herself in the cozy bedroom that had become so familiar over the past few weeks. With a start, she realized it was their last full day in England. Sarah's voice drifted in from the kitchen, accompanied by the aroma of freshly brewed tea. "Em, you awake? I've made breakfast." Emily carefully maneuvered herself into her wheelchair and made her way to the kitchen. Sarah greeted her with a warm smile and a steaming mug of tea. "Morning, sleepyhead," Sarah teased. "I was beginning to think you'd sleep the day away." Emily chuckled, accepting the mug gratefully. "Can you blame me? I'm savoring every last moment here." As they settled in for breakfast, a comfortable silence fell between them. It was Sarah who finally broke it, her voice soft and tentative. "So, have you thought about what you want to do when we get back home?" Emily paused, her fork hovering midair. It was a question she'd been avoiding, but one she knew they needed to address. "Honestly, I'm not sure," she admitted. "Everything feels different now. I don't know if I'm ready to go back to my old job, even if they'd have me." Sarah nodded understandingly. "You know, you don't have to decide everything right away. We've got savings, and I can keep freelancing for a while." Emily smiled gratefully at her sister, but there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "You've already put your life on hold for me, Sarah. I can't ask you to keep doing that." "You're not asking, I'm offering," Sarah replied firmly. "Besides, who says my life is on hold? This trip has been as transformative for me as it has for you." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Sarah went to answer it, returning moments later with a grinning James in tow. "Good morning, ladies," he greeted them cheerfully. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." Emily's face lit up at the sight of him. "Not at all. We were just having breakfast. Care to join us?" As James settled in, the conversation flowed easily, touching on their favorite memories from the trip and their plans for their last day. But there was an undercurrent of melancholy, an awareness that their time together was coming to an end. Finally, James cleared his throat, looking slightly nervous. "Actually, I had an ulterior motive for coming by this morning. I have a proposition for you both." Sarah and Emily exchanged curious glances as James continued. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversations, especially about your experiences, Emily. And well, I have a friend who runs a small publishing house here in England. They're looking to start a new imprint focused on stories of resilience and personal growth." Emily leaned forward, intrigued. "Go on." "Well," James said, his eyes twinkling, "I think your story would be perfect for their first book. A memoir about your journey, from the accident through this trip and beyond." "What do you think?" Emily sat back, stunned. "Me? Write a book? I don't know what to say." Sarah reached out and squeezed her sister's hand. "Em, that's an amazing idea. You've always been a beautiful writer." James nodded enthusiastically. "And the best part is, you wouldn't have to do it alone. They offer co-writing services if you want them, and of course I'd be happy to help in any way I can." Emily's mind raced with possibilities. Writing a book had always been a dream of hers, but she'd never thought it could become a reality like this. "But we're leaving tomorrow," she said hesitantly. "How would this even work?" James leaned forward, his expression earnest. "That's the other part of my proposition. The publishing house has a small writer's retreat not far from here. They offer short-term residencies for authors working on projects. You could stay there for a few months to get started on the book." Sarah's eyes widened. A few months? But what about our flights? Our jobs back home? James held up his hands. I know it's a lot to consider, and of course you'd need to work out the logistics, but I wanted to present the opportunity before you left. The cottage fell silent as the sisters absorbed this unexpected turn of events. Emily's gaze drifted to the window, watching the rain create intricate patterns on the glass. Can we have some time to think about it? She asked softly. James nodded, standing up. Of course. Take all the time you need. I'll be around if you want to discuss it further. After James left, Sarah and Emily sat in thoughtful silence. It was Emily who finally spoke. What do you think, Sarah? Be honest. Sarah took a deep breath. Honestly, I think it's an incredible opportunity. But it's a big decision, and it has to be yours. Emily nodded, her brow furrowed in concentration. It feels right somehow, like everything we've been through has been leading to this, but I'm scared too. What if I can't do it? Sarah moved to kneel beside her sister's chair, taking both of Emily's hands in hers. Em, look at me. You've already done the hardest part. You've survived, you've healed, you've grown. Writing about it? That's just sharing your strength with the world. Tears welled up in Emily's eyes. But what about you? I can't ask you to stay here longer. Sarah smiled, a mischievous glint in her eye. Who says you have to ask? Maybe I've been thinking about a career change myself. That little bookshop in the village is looking for help, you know. Emily laughed through her tears, pulling her sister into a tight hug. When did we become such adventurers? As the rain outside began to taper off, a ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the sisters. In that moment, surrounded by the warmth of possibility and the strength of their bond, Emily made her decision. Let's do it, she said, her voice filled with determination. Let's write this next chapter together. Sarah's face split into a wide grin. That's my girl. Now shall we go find James and give him the good news? As they prepared to leave the cottage, Emily paused at the door, looking back at the space that had been their home for the past weeks. It had been a place of healing, of rediscovery, and now it was becoming a launching pad for their next great adventure. With a deep breath and a smile, Emily turned to her sister. Ready? Sarah nodded, her eyes shining with excitement. Ready. Let's go make some magic, sis. And with that, they stepped out into the gentle English sunshine, ready to embrace whatever challenges and joys their new path might bring. The story of their journey was far from over. In fact, it felt like it was just beginning. The warm September sun filtered through the curtains of Emily's room at the writer's retreat, casting a golden glow across her desk. She sat there, fingers hovering over her laptop keyboard, lost in thought. It had been 3 months since she and Sarah had made the impulsive decision to stay in England, and every day brought new challenges and triumphs. A gentle knock at the door stirred Emily from her reverie. Come in, she called out. Sarah poked her head in, a steaming mug of tea in her hand. How's the writing going, sis? Emily sighed, running a hand through her hair. Slowly. I never realized how hard it would be to put our story into words. Sarah crossed the room and set the mug down on the desk. You'll get there. Remember what your editor said. It's a marathon, not a sprint. Emily nodded, taking a sip of the tea. I know, it's just... Some days it feels like I'm reliving everything all over again. The accident, the pain, the fear. Sarah perched on the edge of the desk, her expression soft. Maybe that's not such a bad thing, Em. It means you're being honest. That's what will make your story resonate with people. A small smile tugged at Emily's lips. When did you get so wise? Must be all those books I'm surrounded by at the shop, Sarah quipped. Speaking of which, I should get going. James is coming by later to help me reorganize the classics section. Emily raised an eyebrow teasingly. Oh? James is coming by again? That's the 3rd time this week. Sarah's cheeks flushed slightly. He's just being helpful. You know how passionate he is about literature. Mm-hmm, Emily hummed, her eyes twinkling. And I'm sure it has nothing to do with the charming bookshop assistant? Sarah laughed, heading for the door. Oh, hush. Focus on your writing, you nosy Parker. As the door closed behind Sarah, Emily turned back to her laptop, feeling reinvigorated. She began to type, losing herself in the flow of words. Hours passed, and Emily barely noticed the changing light outside her window. It wasn't until her stomach growled loudly that she realized how much time had gone by. Stretching, she decided to take a break and go for a short walk around the retreat's grounds. As she made her way down the gravel path, leaning on her cane for support, Emily marveled at how far she'd come. Her physical therapy sessions were less frequent now, and she found herself relying less on her wheelchair. Each step was a reminder of her progress, both physical and emotional. Lost in thought, she almost didn't notice James approaching from the opposite direction. "Emily!" he called out, a warm smile lighting up his face. "I thought I might find you out here." Emily returned his smile, her heart skipping a beat. Despite the months that had passed, James still had that effect on her. "Hello, James. I thought you were helping Sarah at the bookshop." "We finished up early," he explained, falling into step beside her. "I thought I'd come see how you were doing with the writing." They walked in comfortable silence for a moment before Emily spoke. "It's challenging," she admitted. "But in a good way, I think." Emily felt a sense of peace wash over her. For the first time in a long while, she felt truly at home. As they made their way back to the retreat, Emily's mind was already racing with new ideas for her book. She realized that her story wasn't just about overcoming physical challenges. It was about finding strength in unexpected places, about redefining what it meant to heal. That night, as she sat at her desk once more, the words flowed more easily than ever before. Emily wrote about the accident, about the long months of recovery, about the trip that had changed everything. But more than that, she wrote about hope, about resilience, and about the power of love, both familial and romantic, to transform lives. As the clock struck midnight, Emily leaned back in her chair, exhausted but exhilarated. She glanced at the framed photo on her desk, a snapshot of her and Sarah in front of their cottage, taken on their last day as tourists. So much had changed since then, but the core of who they were, two sisters facing the world together, remained the same. With a contented sigh, Emily closed her laptop. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new words to write, new moments to live. But for now, in this quiet moment, she felt nothing but gratitude for the unexpected journey that had led her here, to this new chapter of her life. As she drifted off to sleep, Emily's last thoughts were of the future, bright, uncertain, and full of possibility. Whatever came next, she knew she was ready to face it, one word, one step, one day at a time.